Welcome to the Speckle Park podcast, where we look behind the scenes at the incredible breed designed to maximise profit, minimise inputs to build a high-performance commercial herd. This episode is sponsored by Speckle Park, bred for lasting performance. For first access to sale information, visit jadspecklepark.com.au and subscribe to become a Jad Insider.
Welcome to the Speckle Park podcast. Our guest today is Gerald Wyatt from Classic Livestock Management Services, based out of Maryborough in Queensland. Gerald's career has been analysing traits in livestock that can indicate important fertility, temperament, health and eating quality characteristics. From earwax to scaliness of the tail hair, jawbone and rib structure, and even positioning of hair swirls, these seemingly irrelevant characteristics can tell you so much about your livestock. Old methods of phenotypic selection still apply in modern times, just as they did in the distant past. Welcome to the podcast, Gerald.
Thank you, Amy.
We'll start from the beginning. What's your favourite childhood memory, and did anything from your childhood inspire you to take the career path you chose?
Well, Amy, I was born and raised on a farm in northern Tasmania, and we lived there for 46 years. So I did all the things that I guess most farm kids do during their growing up and their childhood and then their growing up. You know, we had about 4 or 5 kilometres of little creeks on our property, so we did the fishing thing. And not that I think we ever had a licence, but we also, we trapped rabbits, we made Shanghais, we did all of that sort of stuff, just enjoyed being part of nature, and I think from there I developed a really strong respect for nature and the fact that when you start to do things that are against nature, you have to put up with the consequences. So that's something that stayed with me for a very long, all my life for sure, and just learning from nature, what you observe and what you see and experience.
Can you please provide listeners with an overview of your career to date?
Well, as I said, I lived on the family farm until I was 46. So initially, my initial recollections of it was as a dairy farm. And then my father sold the farm when I was about 7 years old or so. So early memories had a little fella out in the dairy watching the cows being milked, of course. And then he decided, and very wisely, I think, at the time, to sell the dairy herd and to go into sheep and wool production. So he bought a flock of Polworth ewes, and so we still had a few cattle hanging around, but most of the time, most of it was during school years, and that it was helping with the sheep and crutching and all that sort of lambing and so on. But then when I left school, the wool boom sort of petered out. That was sort of early to mid 60s, and so we made a decision then to go into beef cattle and also to do quite a bit more cropping, and that meant mainly cereal crops at that time. So we basically worked on an Angus herd. Most of our cows were Angus. We kept that going, and I guess in the late 70s, early 80s, I was looking at our cows and I was starting to think, well, they're looking more like steers than cows. So I thought we'll start to do something about that. And so we started to look around and look at traits that were going to add femininity and all the related things like fertility and calving ease and that to the herd. That proceeded, and we built the herd and so on, and then we had a whole range of other things happening on the farm at the same time. In the late 70s, the Department of Agriculture got worried, and I might add here that all our neighbours were dairy farmers anyway, and in the late 70s, the Department of Agriculture in Tassie got a bit concerned because the New Zealand dairy farmers' production figures were increasing at a fairly strong rate and rapidly outdoing the Tasmanian one. So that didn't go down all that well. So they sent a couple of officers across to New Zealand where they they had a look at what the dairy farmers there were doing, and basically they changed their grazing management to a thing they called block grazing. In other words, high density stocking for short periods of time. And they brought that back to Tassie, and some of the dairy farmers started to take that up because the department were running a 3-day course then they'd developed, and so dairy farmers were going. At the same time, there was also a move away from hay to high dry matter silage, especially amongst dairy farmers. And my next door neighbour, who was a dairy farmer, and myself had been sharing the haymaking operation between us for quite a few years, making small bales, and we were doing 12 to 15,000 a year. Towards the end of the 70s, labour started to get hard to come by, and at times just the two of us were carting 800 to 1,000 bales between milkings every day, so that got a bit tiring. So one of our other neighbours, also a dairy farmer, won a Nuffield scholarship and went to Europe to study dairy farming there, and we asked him to have a look at what the latest fodder conservation techniques were. And when he came back, he bought some brochures and information more about high dry matter silage and the machines that we use to make it. And so both myself and neighbour he was a member of a dairy group that met on a monthly basis on each other's farms, and I was a member of a local beef group. And so we asked them what they thought about this high dry matter silage, and if we bought machines in, would they be interested in having its contract? So that happened, and we were able to basically, we've had really good support from our local farmers, and they were able to give us enough work to justify the decision. And at the same time, I'm seeing all our dairy farmer neighbours, the tanker was going in, an extra time visit every probably 3 days or so. So I thought, this grazing system they're using must be working. So I did the 3-day course. And I thought, well, it works for dairy farmers, dairy cows, it should work for beef cows. So we introduced it on 200 acres of our property, and we had about 150 cows at that stage. And within 12 months, we'd increased our herd numbers to 200. And we were making an extra 400 tonne of silage on the same area. And we got up to about 230 cows on that area, but we just found in the winter months over there, it just got little bit too wet at times. So anyway, we proceeded with that, and so that was one of the main changes that we made. And at the same time, I started to look much more at our females and their type, and looking at ways that we could change some of the traits.
How did you learn the information you now possess? How did you go about learning that?
Well, it started off with a fellow who had been spending a lot of time looking at these older, I guess, if you want to put it, traits. A guy called Peter Chilcott, who had a company at that stage called Supergen, and it's really too long a story to go into it. He contacted me and got me to make some silage for him. About 1980 this was. Peter was a genius at what he could see in cattle. He could look at a cow and tell you she needed vitamin A or vitamin D or whatever it is. He could tell you how many months she was in calf and all that. But unfortunately, he had a little bit of a problem with personality and communication, and he sort of used to tend to upset people a bit. Anyway, when I was having trouble getting payment for the silage job, and he was onto me because our cows used to run along quite often. Our property was on the main highway along the northwest coast of Tassie, and he used to see these cows, and he was onto me about wanting to evaluate them. He said, I can make a huge difference to your cow herd if you let me come and show you what we need to do. So in the end, when he hadn't paid, I said, right, well, you better come and evaluate these cows of ours. So he came, and of course, when he gave me, he couldn't get his invoice book out quick enough and gave me an invoice. I said, oh, just a minute, I'll go and get my checkbook. So I went and got his invoice, and I gave it to him and said, I reckon we're a bit clear now. So that's how it started. But it was his brilliance that started me to just to see our cattle in a different way, and to be able to see the way that they communicated with us through what we saw when we looked sort of, if you like, past the forest.
So you were on the farm until you were in your 40s, did you say?
Yeah, that's right. And then for various reasons, we made a decision that we'd sell the farm. It was a family decision. And so I sort of, we thought, wife was a qualified nurse anyway before we married, and they just started the nursing degree course. So she said, "Oh, I'll get me the nursing degree." And so I thought, well, I sort of liked a bit of a challenge. So I thought, now what's one of the things that's fairly opposite to farming? Because as you're aware, farming's most of the time it's a fairly lonely occupation, and you're not around many people and that. So I thought, oh, well, I'll bite the bullet. I'll do a social work degree. We spent the next 3-4 years travelling up the coast of East Coast mainly of Australia, and we'd had when we bought the first silage harvesters into Australia, and they were actually about the first self-loading silage harvesters coming to Australia. We couldn't find a dealer to bring them in for us, so we ended up dealing directly with the manufacturers, and they offered us the national franchise, which we took up and did for a few years. And we went to a lot of field days on the mainland, especially Victoria and southern New South Wales. And so I met a lot of other producers, and especially some that Peter Chilcott had contact with, and we all had similar views on, what the way we felt we should be breeding our cattle. And so we also had a silage contracting business, which when I sold the silage business to a firm in Victoria, I kept doing some work for them. So that sort of helped us make ends meet while we were doing the degree. But I still got a bit bored, so I decided I'd do a degree in religious studies just as something I had a personal interest with, and I did that and had a sub-major in anthropology. So it was a totally different way to live compared to farming, I guess. So that's sort of what we did then. And then we moved to, wife got a job at Merida Hospital, and so a few acres just out of Merida, and we've been here ever since. And I've worked as a volunteer with Lifeline for quite a few years as a telephone counsellor. I was also director of Lifeline on the Fraser district for 12 months. And I worked in the disability sector part-time while I was doing the cattle work, because in 2000 we formed a few of these like-minded fellas that I'd met over the years, especially from Northern Victoria. We formed a company and called it Classic Livestock Management Services. And most of our next few years we spent doing research to justify the traits that we'd been looking at, to try and to put some objectivity behind what was basically pretty subjective to a lot of people's eyes. So that's what we did. And I had to work to put a bit of bread on the table, if you like. So I worked with disabilities families, as well as setting up an organisation for retired senior men at risk of suicide, living on their own. And so that's still going. We're still part of that. So that was very satisfying. A lot different from cattle work, but in the meantime, I've always had time to keep doing the cattle work. And when I finished at Lifeline and Disability Services about 12, 14 years ago, I really started to look more at doing the evaluations with people then.
What has been a highlight of your career to date, and perhaps what's been a low light?
Oh, I don't sort of look at things as being highlights and lowlights. I look forward to every day and what I'm going to learn that day. And I suppose it's a gratitude for being able to have those learning experiences. I can't specifically say what a specific highlight is. It's just taking the positives with the negatives and being able to balance them out and the learnings from them.
That's a good answer. So when did you start Classic Livestock Management Services, and can you just recap what led to that?
Well, yeah, we actually started in 2000, and I guess it was because I happened to meet these other breeders from mainly, as I said, Northern Victoria, Southern New South Wales, and then we also started to meet fellas further up in New South and in Queensland, and we thought we could put together a system that was able to identify these main traits that we knew were important in beef production. And so that's how we got together one day and spent, I think, about 3 days together putting together the evaluation system. We worked on a 5-point score system, with 1 being the best. I mean, that might sound the back to front to what most people have, but that's sort of the way we went. If it's 1, it's number 1, so it's the best. That was our way of thinking in those days. And we came up with, we did modify it a bit over the years, but what it is now, we have what we call our primary trait evaluation, and then we have beef traits and breeding traits. And we've added linear measuring, which we'll probably talk about a bit more later.
So I guess to extend on that, when you go over to a client's property, what is it that you're doing? What are you looking for?
Well, we start off with clients by using our primary trait evaluation, which looks at meat quality, hormonal activity, milk quality and milk quantity in females, and added to that in bulls is teat placement and epididymis. So they're the things that we think are the most critical things. And having said that, within each of those main primary traits, there are a range of other traits which are replicated again through breeding traits that we're looking at. So we're not just looking at those specific traits when the animal walks up to the crush. So, for example, if they're hobbling, or if there's something that stands out with them, we'll take that into account when we're grading. That's what we do in the primary, the first visits, and quite often with most of our clients, that's we just do that. And the first visit we'll grade all their herd, both females and males, and then after that we'll just mainly do the replacement heifers, and of course we replacement bulls.
How many clients do you service, including studs, and what breeds are represented?
At the moment, we're probably visiting about 15 clients, so not necessarily all, probably only 2 or 3 studs. Our whole aim is, when we go onto a property, is to show the breeders what we do. And so our ultimate aim is for them to be able to do their own selection. And whether that takes 1 year or 10 years, that's totally up to the breeder. We're sort of not there this is not a money-making operation for us. And at my age anyway, I just look at it, well, I'm comfortable the way I'm living. Let's share our knowledge with anyone who's prepared to have a listen and a look at what we do. And that's why we run a 5-day course once a year with a colleague who's Albert Hancock. He's been using this system for 30 plus years. He's also a biodynamic farmer just out of Glen Innes in New South Wales, similar to what we also did on our property. And he's got a wealth of knowledge on how the system works and that. So we run an occasional 1-day workshop as well.
Geographically, what area do you cover in your travels?
That varies. Mainly, we've had a very good client, one really good client in the Northern Territory, and we've had several other properties that we've visited and shown people what we do. And then we've been mainly Queensland and New South Wales, a little bit in Victoria.
We're all familiar with the phrase as useful as tits on a bull. Bulls do have small teats, and they tell us a very useful story, don't they? What can we learn from their placement on the scrotum?
We've found that if a bull has 1 or 2 of his teats on his scrotum, then it'll affect the teat shape on his daughters. So in other words, what we look at when we look at the scrotum, we're basically looking at a mirror of that bull's daughter's udder. And so with the teats on their scrotum mean that his daughters, not necessarily in their first, second or third calving, but as they get older, will develop bulbous or bottle teats. And I think most of us have also seen cows where their front 2 quarters are much smaller than the back 2, and they sort of angle up into the flank. And that's another dead set indicator that their father had at least 1 teat off the scrotum.
So where's the perfect positioning of those smaller teats?
Probably up to about 1 centimetre in front of the scrotum with the back teat, and then another probably 2.5, 3 centimetres.
But not on it?
Not on it, no. And they need to be a nice teat shape as well. We've found bulls with basically no teats, just 2 patches of bare skin. I've also seen bulls with 6 teats.
What are you looking for when you inspect animals for earwax and scaliness of tail hair?
Right, so that's that's a sign of butterfat in cows. And the flakes in the tail, the yellower that they are, the higher the butterfat that cow will produce.
And can you go into some detail around the benefits of butterfat, what that all means?
Have you got a day or so? No, I think it's something that's been pretty well neglected by the beef industry to a great degree. It's critical for the skeletal development of a calf. That's probably the main thing. And that's why we see the difference between beef cows or beef cattle and dairy cattle. One of the main differences is that skeletal structure. And you don't see on beef cattle like you do on dairy cattle, high chines, prominent shoulders, prominent hooks, prominent pins. And that's because they were weaned off their mothers at maybe 1-2 days old, and in many cases these days fed a synthetic milk, or in the olden days skim milk where the butterfat had been taken out of it. So ideally, a bit of research I've read shown that if you could feed butterfat to your calves until they were 18 months old, you'd get a full skeletal development.
The hair pattern off the escutcheon or the milk line on the rear end of an animal tells its own story. Can you explain how and why you assess the escutcheon?
The escutcheon is an indicator of the amount of milk a cow will give. And I used to hear our old dairy farmer neighbours talk about the milk line. And that's something that's on a day-old calf. And so they could select their heifers for production the day it was born. And they, quite a few of them did that. And so they gave them those heifers a bit of special treatment. They probably had an old broken down cow and they'd have 4 or 5 of these calves running on that cow.
So the wider the better?
Wider the better, and the further up. That varies a lot, and bulls have them as well, only they're nowhere near as prominent in a bull. Any time when the escutcheon goes up to the tail of the bull, that cow is going to produce plenty of milk. And if it comes about halfway up to the vulva, then she will produce enough milk as a rule, given the feed, to rear a calf.
Is there a tipping point where there's too much, so to speak?
Oh, probably not really with beef cattle. They tend to be able to modify their production. You know, if they've only got one calf, they won't produce enough milk every day for 3 or 4 calves. Once they've started to, from about that 2 to 3 weeks old.
So hair swirls, the swirls of hair on the animal's face or forehead and along its spine, what does the position of hair swirls indicate?
Well, first of all, on the head, Temple Grandin and some of her colleagues in the US have done quite a bit of work in this, and their belief is that the higher that swirl is up on the forehead of an animal, the more temperamental they'll be. My experience is a little different to that. I tend to think if it's below the eyes and off centre, then they'll be more temperamental. I've just noticed that with the cattle as we're grading them and they're in the crush. The other thing to look for is that swirl needs to be a nice tight swirl, not elongated. If it's elongated, it's a sign that animal won't be as productive as you want it, and also question marks around fertility.
What about hair swirls in other parts of the body?
Okay, so probably the most important one is the adrenal swirl, which is that swirl on the spine where the hair coming from the neck meets the hair coming along the back. And so ideally that needs to be, particularly with Bos Taurus cattle, needs to be at least no further back than the shoulders. And with Bos Indicus, we found that we can be a little bit easier on that because they'll still be quite fertile if it's back, up to 8-10 inches along the spine or behind the hump. It's more difficult to see on the Bos Indicus with the hump.
So that spinal swirl is an indicator of fertility, is it?
Yeah. And also we've had a number of clients since we've talked to them about this who have taken note when they've been preg testing, and they've all said to us that the cows with the swirl further forward are always the cows that get in calf on the first cycle. One other thing of interest is that with cows, when the hair on that swirl is standing up, it means that they've got elevated estrogen levels. And the two times that that'll happen during their life is when they're cycling, or around the 4 to 5 month period of gestation when the calf tends to turn a bit in the womb, so they need that extra estrogen and then usually the hair will stay standing up then in that swirl until they have their calf.
Are there any other hair swirls that you look at around the body?
The thymus swirl is on the brisket. That's a pretty important one we look at, and that will determine the overall health of the animal, their ability to fight disease and that sort of thing. And the bigger that is and the shinier it is, the better. The stronger they'll be internally. The pancreas swirl is where the hair from the front of the animal meets the hair from the back of the animal on the flank, and that will move as a cow goes through her gestation. That's the sort of thing that people like Gerald Fry and Peter Chilcott could identify that fairly accurately and tell you when a cow is going to calve. I'm not very good at that. I don't do that if I can help it. Yeah. Again, it's just observation.
When you assess an animal's jawbone and rib structure, what are you looking for?
We're looking for the shape of the bone, and we always only use 2 points to keep consistency. One is on the outside of the jaw, opposite where the two jaw bones meet, and the last rib bone about a third or halfway down. And we're looking for what we call a concave bone, flat or concave. And the flatter or more concave and the higher up the bone it is, the more tender we found the meat to be. And we've done some Warner Bratz shear force tests on samples that we've graded and so on. And so we've got enough indication there to know that we can be reasonably accurate with that.
So what other validation work have you carried out to demonstrate that this system actually does work?
Well, apart from the Warner Bratz, when A2 milk first came out, I rang the scientist in Auckland who discovered that gene protein in the milk. This was about 2000, something around about then, and had a long conversation with him about what we did and what he was doing. And we'd always thought, all the fellas in our group at the time had always thought that there could well be a correlation between milk and meat quality. And so when I told him what we did and that we developed a system for identifying what we thought was tenderness on the hoof, he said, well, you grade some of your animals using your system, send me over the hair samples and I'll do a DNA test for A2 milk on them. And A2 milk is much higher in beta-casein protein, butterfat, in other words. So we did that, and overall I think we did about 300 or 400 samples over 2 or 3 years, and they basically came back around about a 95 to 97% correlation. So that gave us a fairly strong indication. We've also done work on the omegas in fat, and we did only a small sample because it cost us an arm and a leg, and we never had that much money, unfortunately, to do really extensive trials. But we took fat samples from 20 cattle that had been on pasture only, 20 that had been on pasture but had self-feeding grain bins in the paddock, and 20 that were on 100 days grain only. Results were that 19 of the 20 on grass came back the highest in omega-3, and the other one was just probably second or third in the next group, which was also fairly set in the next 20. They were just about all sort of mid-range, and then we found that the grain-fed ones were all higher in omega-6.
You authored the book, The Vision Tender, The Keys to Livestock Mastery. What led you to write the book, and what topics are covered?
Well, we just wanted to, I guess, conserve the knowledge and that, particularly the old cowboy wisdom, if you like, of what we were looking at, and where possible, integrate it with, the new science, because, we've got a lot of respect also for things like being able to measure eye muscle and marbling and all of that sort of stuff. That's all now a big part of the industry. And also just to add a bit about particularly my own personal experience with grazing management, fodder conservation, and then some stuff about personal care for the managers, because that's so often neglected, and so often we tend to put everything else first in our, I guess, sense of caring for everything else of ourselves. And so with what I've been fortunate enough to learn over the years in that area through my other work, I wanted to share some of that with people, things like the challenge of change and, making changes, planning, and, I often put something in our newsletters about that as well. I was very fortunate to be able to do a course in neuro-linguistic programming, which is basically about the art science of human excellence. And that's how we communicate both internally and externally through particularly our senses. And so that really validated a lot of the stuff I'd been familiar with over my life, on the farm and then working with people. So I just wanted to share a bit of that. And I've also put in there a process on valuing your herd, which is something that I converted from one of our counselling processes.
What are the advantages of your system of assessing cattle?
Mainly, it's something that you can do on the spur of the moment as you walk through your herd, whether it be in the paddock or in the yards. And you can just, once you become familiar with these things to look for, you can look for them in your herd every day. I guess the other thing that I haven't sort of touched on much was hormonal activity, which, you can see that visually by the shine on particularly on things like the thymus swirl. And you can always tell the later maturing animals by the fact that they don't shed their hair as early as those other animals in the flock. And it's a really good indicator of, how the pituitary gland's operating in your animals, and the endocrine system, which is basically the cow's motor, if you like. And when you've got them in the crush, we feel for that hormonal activity by feeling the oiliness and the flexibility and the fineness of the skin and so on. And you can do that yourself when they're in the yards or in the crush. You can just run your hand down their spine and look, and you'll see the oil if they're really hormonally active.
Does your work correlate in any way to the Bonsma principles taught by renowned South African animal scientist Dr. Jan Bonsma?
Well, we've got a lot of respect for Bonsma's work, and we use his measuring system, linear measuring, pretty often. Well, both Albert and I use that a lot when we're selecting bulls for clients. So we found it to be a really good indicator, and it also works in with a lot of especially our visual confirmation traits that we look for. I guess just to mention what we consider to be about the most important ones. One is the heart girth to top line measurement. That is from the top knot to the pins. That needs to be at least the same. And the bigger the heart girth is compared to the top line, up until probably 6 or 8 inches at least, then it means that animal's probably got a better capacity to produce meat.
Where do you see the beef industry in 10 years' time?
Well, who knows? It's certainly progressed a long way since in my time. There are things that are difficult to predict, I guess, in terms of where it'll be. I'd like to see more of our country in Australia used for grazing, rather than the government pay producers to feed their cattle in droughts and that, subsidise or have grants for clearing more land or making more land. There's plenty of land out there that's just just grassland that you can't use a mower on it. I think there's plenty of room there, and I know a lot of people say that that's just more work. But I was brought up in Tassie where you had to feed, if you want to keep a consistent herd, and especially with breeding, whether it be sheep or cattle, you needed to feed them in the winter. Otherwise, you had to sell off and then buy in again every year. And the cost of doing that, we just worked out wasn't viable.
So as we move on to what you do with regards to the Speckle Park breed, you first assessed Jad Speckle Park cattle in 2019 and have been back several times since to both assess our cattle and present twice at our A Day in the Jad Yards workshop. What have you learned about Speckle Park cattle through your assessments?
Well, I've learned that they are probably one of the fastest combination of breeds to come together as one breed and look to have a set characteristics that they've been able to, it's taken many breeds many years to become easy to recognise as a different breed, not just their colour. I mean, a couple of the things that have stood out for us is their milk quantity, the escutcheons on your heifers. It just hit me in the eye the first time I saw a pen of heifers. Hang on, all these escutcheons are coming up to the vulva and they're about 1 to 2 inches wide in just about every heifer. That was something I hadn't really seen before. And when we graded those few heifers, they averaged 2, which is on our scale, which is as good as it gets. So, getting that sort of consistency, and I guess we've always said that your gene pool will determine your consistency and repeatability in their offspring. And one of the things with most of the, if you like, the composite breeds, it's taken them many years to even get close to the consistency that I saw, and the femininity in the heifers that I see there. And I think a lot of things, and we've talked about this, that the person who developed the breed had a huge amount of foresight in introducing particularly the Jersey as one of those breeds, because I'm certain that that's where the milk quality and quantity and the meat tenderness, which are all, we believe, correlated, come from.
How unique are the characteristics that you have observed in Speckle Park cattle compared to other breeds or cattle that you have assessed over the years?
Well, I've seen the what I just said about the milk. It's much more consistent in the escutcheon, and there's a nice, they've got a nice amount of angularity for a beef breed, which is important, and the femininity, which, that slender neck rolling into a nice even coverage over the shoulders, and then following on into the ribs where, so often we see that dip behind the ribs, whether that's through too high chine or whatever, and that's when you measure those animals, they'll always be shorter in the heart girth than they are the top line, so you're not getting enough meat. Yeah, no, the consistency is something that, I was surprised at, given that they're such a young breed.
When people ask you what breed of cattle they should run on their property, what is your advice?
Usually I suggest to them that they look at the climate in their area and find a climate in the Northern Hemisphere mainly, where most of our cattle originated from, that is as close as possible to the climatic conditions that they have, and start with that breed, because, they'll be genetically, if you like, already adapted to that climate, and where they go from there. I mean, plenty of breeds are very adaptable to a number of climates. You see that in the British breeds. Jerseys, for example, is another one that's quite adaptable to warmer climates.
What do you see as the strengths and weaknesses of the Speckle Park breed in the context of the Australian beef industry?
I think they need to keep going down the path they're going in, making a niche for themselves as an acceptable breed. And that's, you more than anyone can tell us how much hard work goes into that. You're up against some pretty, in particular, 2 or 3 big breed societies that have got the capital behind them to do a lot of advertising and promotion for themselves. And so, it's a case of just keep on working hard at what you're doing and providing the data that breeders need to be able to say, well, hang on a minute, this is a breed that we should take a hard look at next time we're looking to buy a bull, for example, or breeding heifers. The other good thing about them, and I think what's helped keep the gene pool fairly tight, is that the other breeds like the Galloway and the Scottish Highlander that are part of Speckle Park, I think that's right, isn't it?
Yep.
Yeah. So they come from tight gene pools originally. We've graded quite a few, we've graded a few Galloway and not that many Highlanders and Jerseys. So, Jerseys were isolated on the island of Jersey for over 200 years. So they developed a very tight gene pool. Galloways are also just in that one area in Scotland where they were bred basically in one valley. So they are a tight gene pool. Scottish Highland are the same. So, we're big on keeping gene pools tight, because the bigger your gene pool gets, the less consistent your offspring will be, the less repeatable, and less predictable.
Exactly. As we near towards the end of this podcast, what's the most important lesson you've learned in your career so far?
We've got 2 eyes to see with, 2 ears to hear with, but only one mouth. So it's about seeing, hearing, and learning.
Speaking a little less than the other two.
Yeah.
Who has been your most important professional mentor?
I've thought about this before, and I don't think I've got one particular one. I mean, I learned a lot from Peter Chilcott. We did a lot of work with an American called Gerald Wyatt until he passed away about 4 years ago. And he really got us on track with linear measuring. And we did a lot of work together over the years. We spent up to a week doing nothing but looking at cattle in yards and measuring and all sorts of things. And then, of course, Alex Podolinsky with the biodynamics, who's just an amazing man. That changed a lot about, how I perceived soil management and stuff. And I've had a couple of other mentors when I went over into working with people that were very important to me. Yeah.
What's one piece of advice you would give someone either starting a cattle stud or a commercial producer starting a cattle enterprise in their business?
Believe in what you're doing and stay committed. Yeah. Don't get dragged in by all the stuff that's going on around you, Just know what you're doing and keep doing it, providing, of course, it's working, and be open to change when it's needed.
What's your favourite quote and why?
I thought about that a bit too. One of them, I suppose, is breeding is an art and not only a science.
So now for the podcast signature question. How would you answer the question, why Speckle Park?
I think that they've got as much as any other beef breed's got, and how you take that forward, in your own environment is up to you. You haven't had the time or the numbers behind Speckle Park to develop the sort of promotional campaigns and that to the degree that some of the other, really old breeds and most popular breeds have. However, I see a huge amount of potential because you've already got some very good bloodlines there. And, I think I said last time I was down there to your place at your open day, one bull I felt the bone on, it was just outstanding. He was going to be, you'd cut the meat off him with the back of your knife, just about guarantee it. So, there's so much about the Jersey too in there. We talked about fat, and people tend to go off yellow fat on meat, whereas usually the yellow fat is the highest in omega-3, and it's also a sign of high butter fat in that animal. So I won't say what there's anything about white fats, but...
Yeah, fair enough. Well, thank you very much for joining us in today's episode. For anybody who would like to learn more about Classic Livestock Management Services, learn more at their website, which is classiclivestock.com.au. Thanks very much for joining us today, Gerald.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, Amy. It's a pleasure.